Hey everybody, Anthony here from Crazy Tech Lab, and as you can see, I've got quite a few M.2 heatsinks here today. In fact, it's pretty much every single one I could lay my hands on. I've scoured Amazon, and I've spoken to a few manufacturers as well, such as Silverstone, Aqua Computer, Adata, and Alphacool, and those kind of people. EK Water Blocks as well are in here. So there's a whole bunch of M.2 SSDs, and I'm going to be looking at how effectively they cool your SSD, how easy they are to install, and what they're like in terms of value as well, because the prices range here from about $10 all the way up to about $30, and it's whether or not you should be paying $30 for an M.2 SSD, or indeed paying any money at all. Are they actually worth it? There's been a lot of controversy out there as to whether M.2 heatsinks are actually worth it, and here I've got the Alphacool one fitted to a Samsung 960 Pro. As you can see, they're fairly dainty, but probably the best thing about them is that they make the SSD look so much better. One thing I've really had beef with is the fact that M.2 SSDs, especially the PCI Express variety, they are really, really cool things. They're really, really fast. They're like 6 times as fast as a SATA SSD. And they're just really cool things to have slotted into your motherboard. Yes, they're expensive, but for me, they're one of the sexiest things going on with computer hardware at the moment. So I want to see my SSD, kind of looking really cool. And in a lot of situations, especially small form factor builds, you won't be able to fit them into a PCI Express card. So your only option is to use them like this and slot them into your motherboard. Now, there are some manufacturers that are bringing out M.2 heatsink equipped M.2 SSDs that slot straight into your motherboard, and that's great to see, but a lot of people just use a label on top, and for me, it's short selling them basically. Or underselling them, should I say, because they just don't look as great as they can with heatsinks. Now, with heatsinks, they do make a difference. They can and do make a difference. I've seen anything up to 15-20 degrees drop in low temperature, but it's also important to bear in mind that there can be quite a lot of variation depending on where you mount it, in terms of, is it in amongst all the components on your motherboard, like north of the graphics card slot and hidden amongst the memory slots, not really getting a lot of airflow. But if you mount it on the bottom of your motherboard, it will potentially be making use of your case's airflow, and you'll be getting much lower temperatures than you would without the SSD. So I'll be testing each SSD in both situations, so when it's crowded amongst your graphics card and CPU socket, that kind of thing, and also if it's mounted away from all those components at the bottom of your motherboard, just to see which SSDs are better for each scenario. So again, I say there's been quite a bit of controversy, and a lot of it does actually stem to the fact that some of the tests that have rated M.2 heatsinks negatively, they've actually tested with M.2 heatsinks that have components on both sides. Now, the Samsung 960 Pro does not have components on both sides. It only has components on the top side, which will be in direct contact with the heatsink, and that is what you want. What you don't really want to do is have an SSD where there are components on the bottom side as well, because that can potentially hamper cooling, on that side of the SSD if you've got a big heatsink on top, blocking airflow and that kind of thing. So, and also, a lot of the heat load is going to be on the bottom side as well, and you're not really doing anything to solve that. So I can only recommend that these results are, comparable in terms of Samsung's M.2 SSDs, because they have components on the top side. But the results may well be comparable with other M.2 SSDs as well. But because it's such a varying situation here, that's the only thing I can recommend. So anyway, let's crack on with the testing. And first of all, as I say, I'm going to test fit each heatsink to the M.2 heatsink, or to the M.2 SSD, should I say, and then we will go forwards and have a look at how each one performs. So let's crack on. Okay, so first up is Alphacool's M.2 heatsink, and this little jobby retails for $22, $21.99 on Amazon. It's readily available pretty much anywhere in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. So it's an interesting one in that I think it's the only one here that doesn't have like a proper heatsink. It's just a slab of aluminium, or 2 slabs of aluminium, should I say, that are anodized and sit on the top and bottom of your M.2 SSD. I quite like that because it means that in certain situations you can fit this SSD where you can't fit any of the others, because you can see there it's literally, I don't know, probably 4-5 millimeters thick. Whereas if you've got, you know, heat sinks, actual, you know, fins on the top of here, that's obviously adding massively to the height of the heatsink. So there's potential for mounting this inside a laptop, or, you know, in situations, as I say, on a normal motherboard where you can't fit any of the other SSDs. Now, I've been using this one for quite a while. As you can see, it's a tad scratched, so it's not new out of the box like the other ones, so apologies there, Alphacool. But I have been using it in several systems and it's worked pretty well. The one thing I do have an issue with, though, is the fitment. It's one of the trickiest M.2 heatsinks that I've actually tested and used, for the simple reason that it just uses these small metal clips. Now, I think the EK Waterblocks heatsink does use the similar clips, but unlike the Alphacool ones here, you can see they're just a uniform U-shape. They're the same length on either side as they go up, the little clips. But on the EK Waterblocks one of the clips is slightly shorter than the other, and that means that you can hook the big one round the bottom of the heatsink and then just clip the other one over the top, and that works quite well. But as you'll see in a second, I'll just mount this onto the SSD. It can prove quite tricky to actually mount it, and something I really don't like is that there's a lot of pressure required to do that as well. But as I say, I've done this several times with this heatsink, and I haven't had any ill effects, so I can't really, you know, say whether or not, you know, the pressure will cause problems for you. But as you can see, there's you get some thermal pads in the box, and basically the heatsink just slaps on top of your SSD there, and another thermal pad and heatsink for the bottom as well. I should note that you do have to mount both the bottom and top sections of this heatsink, because these clips basically won't work otherwise, because it needs that depth in order to for them to actually provide any tension. So here we go. I'm going to try and get these clips on. So the first one is always a lot easier because obviously you're able to kind of lift up the other corners, and then as you move around it gets progressively harder. But I will show you that it is possible. I wouldn't really recommend opening up these clips to start with, and then using pliers to clamp them down afterwards for obvious reasons. You've got an expensive SSD in the middle there, and you don't want to crush it or anything like that. So we're nearly there, we're halfway, so that one gets on a little easier, he says, and then it's got stuck on the edge. And you also have to be aware of the heatsinks moving underneath you here, because you do need to maintain access to the screw hole at the bottom and also to the connector on that end as well. So one more to go, and this is usually the most difficult one because all the other ones are in place. Oh, that's actually gone on. Okay, now I have to admit that I have used this SSD a few times, so these clips have probably become a little looser than they were to start with. So while I managed to do that in, what, a minute or two, it will probably take you longer to do that the first time out of the box. Saying that, you know, there's plenty of pressure there, even though I've used it a few times, and it did perform well. I'll talk about the performance at the end of the show, and for now I'm just going through and showing you what each one looks like and how easy they are to fit. So that's it for the Alphacool one. We'll move on to the next heatsink. Okay, this time we've got a heatsink from waterblock manufacturer Aqua Computer, and as far as I know, it's only available in black, and it retails for $23.99 on Amazon. So it's slightly more expensive than the EK Waterblocks heatsink, but it does actually have fins on top, as you can see, unlike the Alphacool heatsink. It's still fairly thin. I'm guessing it's about 5 or 6 millimeters, 5 or 6 millimeters in height, and it's called the Aqua Computer Cryo M.2 Micro. So unlike some of Aqua Computer's other heatsinks and water blocks for SSDs, this one can be mounted purely onto an M.2 heatsink, so there's no need for a PCI Express card or anything like that. And there's some pretty good instructions in the box as well. It tells you exactly how to do it, and you basically get two large clips, very similar to EK Waterblocks' method. You've got one large flange on one side and a smaller sort of standard clip on the other. So you basically just hook it round using the smaller clip and use the large flange to kind of clip it on top. And now there's no underside heatsink here. All you get for the underside is a protective strip, which I will put on now onto the SSD. And that, I'm presuming, is just to protect the underside from the clips. So you obviously need to make sure that that's going to be in the way of the clips, just to protect it from scratches and that kind of thing. And as you can see, in the middle of each clip is a slightly raised section, and that's meant to come in contact with that protective strip that I've just installed. So we've done the underside, and all that's left is to mount the top side, 1mm thick, I'm guessing, thermal pad. So we will just pop that onto the underside of the heatsink as well. So that looks like it covers the entire length of the heatsink, so it's fairly easy to install. You don't need to measure up or anything like that. So there we go, that's all installed, and what we need to do is just remove the final protective layer, having removed the other side first. There we go. And there are no other screw holes or mounting holes or anything else to worry about. You just literally plonk that on top of your M.2 SSD so it lines up with both the port, giving plenty of clearance down the bottom there, and also up the top here for the screw mounting point. So mounting it, now I haven't actually done that, I've done this yet, I've literally just opened it, taken it out of the box. So let's move the box out of the way, and we will just use a similar method to EK Waterblocks, I think. Actually, no, it's not. I'm just looking at the instructions because I've literally just opened the box here, and what they say is that you actually slide these on. If you have a look at the instructions there, they actually show you sliding the clips on. So typical man there, not reading the instructions, and I just assumed that it fitted the same way as the other heatsinks did. But saying that, it's not particularly easy to actually get this on. I'd actually prefer to use the clipping method, I think, but I will go with the instructions for now, just to see if I can actually do that. Let's move that heatsink down a bit and try again. So it seems to get on one side fairly easily, but the other side really does not want to go at the moment. I am inclined to follow the instructions because they are quite big, hefty clips after all. Ah, there we go. Yeah, I've got it. Yeah, so you just kind of need to pry the clip apart a little bit, like I did there, and then just gradually work its way down onto the M.2 heatsink. So I think that's enough for one end, and then we'll just slide it onto the other. Now this side could well prove to be trickier than the first, because there's already tension, as we've found before. So pry it apart, and that's yeah, there we go. That's it's not too difficult, all said and done. It's not too bad. One problem I am having though is that once I've fitted the rear protective layer, that's not really holding on the back. So as you can see, it's kind of pushing that protective layer back, which isn't ideal. In fact, I can't really get over that. It's just, yeah, I think you can see that it's just kind of scraping up and pushing it, and I think it's taking off the it's taken off the heatsink label as well. So not a great start there from Aqua Computer. I can't seem to get this heatsink on without destroying the label on the underside, and I kind of want to keep that because on the Samsung SSDs it's actually doubly acts as a heatsink as well. It's actually a very thin copper sheet. So I'm just going to try one last thing here to get this thing on, which is to clip it from one side, and I can't see that working because that's such an enormous clip. Oh no, maybe, there you go, that's actually worked. So interesting. So what's actually happened there is I've actually completely ignored the instructions. I've clipped it on from one side like I did with the Alphacool and EK Waterblocks SSDs. completely ignoring the instructions, and that has worked because following the instructions, as you can see, it's been pushing up the label. So I'm just going to take the other side off and see if I can do that on the other end as well, because it was starting to push the label up on that one. So can I do that on both ends? So I'm just trying to get in the camera here while I'm doing this and moving around. It's a bit difficult. So I'm just going to try and reach around and stretch that heatsink over and then try to clip it on. And oh dear, Aqua Computer, your instructions are very, very wrong. I would not want to, yeah, basically if you follow the instructions, you're going to completely mangle the underside and any labels that are there. As you can see, I've just done that quite easily by reaching round using the small clip to hook round and then pull it round on the other side, and that's worked absolutely fine. So yeah, it's a bit of a silly mistake there from Aqua Computer. I'm surprised about that. I can't imagine that they've actually tested this heatsink with an M.2 SSD which has got a label on the underside, because basically that was pulling mine off, and it was stopping me from getting it on. And I don't really want to have to start removing labels, because that will definitely void your warranty as well. So yeah, it's a pretty good heatsink, I have to say. It's good quality. You can feel it's fairly solid. There's no sharp edges. It looks kind of cool. But as I say, the instructions are completely wrong. You need to clip those, mount those clips by clipping them on around and over the top, not by sliding them on as the instructions say. So apart from that, it's pretty good. You can see how it performs later, and let's move on to the next heatsink. Okay, so we've now moved on to probably the coolest heatsink on test that I'm looking at today, and it is the Adata XPG Storm RGB, which is, as you can see, is the only SSD on test to have not only RGB lighting, but it's actually got its own tiny little fan as well. So for $28.99, it's only about $10 more than a lot of the heatsinks on test, a bit more than the very cheapest ones that you can get. But considering you're getting a heatsink that's got RGB lighting, and as you can see, it's compatible with Asus Aura, Gigabyte Fusion, and MSI's Mystic Light. It's got its own RGB lighting and a fan as well, so it's got active cooling. That's not a bad deal in my eyes. So here it is, a little bundle of joy that it is, and as you can see that it's barely any bigger than the actual heatsink. In fact, I think it's the actual SSD. In fact, I think the SSD is actually slightly longer. And look at that fan, it's absolutely tiny in there. And what's more, inside it kind of looks like the fan just blows over the RGB and fan cable circuitry there, but it doesn't. It's actually blocked from doing that. It's also blocked at the rear end, which means that the air has to come out down through these heatsinks at the base here, which is really, really good, because it means that the fan is actually doing something. It's actually blowing air over that heatsink to cool it down. Now, in terms of powering the fan, you can do so via a Molex cable, or you can use a normal 3-pin fan header and connect to your motherboard. You might be able to do that if you want to control the fan speed. I'm anticipating it to be fairly noisy at full speed, because most small fans are, to be honest. But at least you do have the option of tuning it down, and to be honest, any active cooling is going to make a huge difference to the temperatures that your SSD runs at with this installed. So there are a bunch of cables to deal with, including those two power cables, but there's also a 4-pin RGB LED header here that will connect to your motherboard, if it has RGB lighting, of course, and a compatible header. So on the underside, you get a kind of a fairly sticky thermal pad, and the idea is that you basically mount your M.2 SSD in there as shown, and line up the screw hole, and then Adata includes a couple of replacement screws to replace the ones that included with your motherboard, because obviously you need a slightly longer screw to go through the heatsink and around the other side. Now, I do have one concern with this heatsink, which is that there's no instructions. There's nothing online. I've used a product barcode scanner there to go on my phone. I've also looked on the website, and there don't seem to be any manuals or instructions as to how to install this thing. That's somewhat of an issue, because you need to know which screw to use, or to actually use the screws in the first place. It would also be useful, you know, for you know, less advanced users as to what to do with all these cables. But also these clips on here, there's a big gap under here, and my fear is that once you mount it, the pressure's all going to be at this end, and I'm just afraid of it doing something like this. I'll just try and force it down so it does it. So I don't know if you can see that, but because I've forced that down due to pressure at this end, that heats at the SSD actually flipped down, and there's now a big gap running down here. So I'm just kind of concerned. I mean, that's going to happen when I, you know, secure it into the slot, and I'll just see if I can do that again just to show you. But if you kind of push it down there, you can hear a click, and that's basically the thermal pad and heatsink and cooler coming away from the SSD because I've applied pressure here, like I would do if I was screwing everything down onto the motherboard. So remains to be seen as to how effective that's going to be. And now the thermal pad there is fairly sticky. I have to actually press down quite hard. So whether that's actually going to happen when I mount it to the motherboard is a different matter. But I'm just trying to see, I don't think there's any. Yeah, I thought there was like a protective plastic layer on there that I hadn't taken off, but I think it's that's all ready to go on there. So yeah, remains to be seen how this is going to perform. It is fairly tool free. There's no nasty clips to deal with or anything like that. You literally just screw it all into place, and hopefully that will be it. We will see. So on face value though, I mean, what a cool little device. You actually get a fan, RGB lighting in there. I'll try and take some photos and videos of that later. And yeah, for just like $10 more than some of the more the more expensive bare heat sinks on test, that could well be worth spending a little extra cash for. The downside, of course, is that it's absolutely massive. You've got probably the biggest heatsink on test, and you're looking at, you know, a fairly tall. I'm guessing it's probably getting on for 2 centimeters there, so sort of 18-20 millimeters thick. So there's no way that this is going to fit in an M.2 slot that's got a graphics card hanging over the top, for example. So yeah, we'll have to see how everything fits later on. So let's move on to the next heatsink. Okay, so next up we've got the EK Waterblocks heatsink, and as you can see I've already unboxed it here and trimmed the thermal pads to size, so you're not waiting around waiting for me to do that. And yeah, it's a really nice looking heatsink. It's available in several different colours. I've got the silver one here. It's also available in black and a blue and a few other colours, I believe, so it's quite cool for colour matching to your motherboard or your case. And it's also one of the easier heatsinks to mount using metal clips here as well. It's a bit easier to install than the Alphacool heatsink, for example. And we're looking at a price of $17.99, so it's one of the more affordable heatsinks as well. And it's quite chunky. You're probably looking at a good sort of 6-7 millimeters of thickness there, as you can see. And but it is really exquisite. It's got like a lovely mirror finish there, so it looks really attractive when it's mounted to your SSD, to your motherboard on top of your SSD. So let's talk about the installation, and thankfully you get a really good set of instructions from EK Waterblocks here. Now I would mention that there are a couple of things that the instructions aren't too good at. So while I've said that they are good, they kind of show you where to place the thermal pads and which side to place the thermal pads as well, because there are two thicknesses here. There is a 0.5 mil and a full millimeter thick pad. The full millimeter goes on the top, the 0.5 millimeter goes on the bottom, and the bottom is a much thinner heatsink that sits on the underside of the SSD. So that's where the thinner pad goes, as you can see that I've already mounted that there. Now, in terms of installation, all you do is you just place the thermal pad onto the bottom heatsink, place the SSD in place as so, and just making sure once you've done that, if you just turn it up the right way, if I can actually get it up off the table here because it's such a thin heatsink, all you need to do is to make sure that there's plenty of space clearance at the bottom here on the port, and also at the top that there's you can get easy access to that hole to actually screw the heatsink down. Sorry, the actual SSD down. So we've done the bottom side. So we're now moving on to the top, and it's exactly the same. Just make sure that your heatsink, your heat pad thermal pad would line up with all the modules on top of the SSD, all the memory chips, and you basically just place it on top like so. Now, the clips, as I say, are fairly easy to deal with, but there's a couple of things that you need to make sure of. Number one is that you're using the right side to actually bend up and clip over. So they hook from underside, and you'll see that there are two clips on top. Now they look quite different. This one here has a big kind of flange that kind of flies off at an angle, and that's the one that you want to be bending around to clip over the top of the heatsink second. So you mount this one first, the flatter side, and then you do the top side, this one with this big flange that kind of goes round and clips over the top. Now there's a second thing that you need to be aware of, and as you can see there hopefully on the camera, there are 4 notches in the lower side of the heatsink. And you need to make sure that the clips slot in over these. So you can't just clip, mount the clips on the ends or in the middle. You need to slot it in on these notches that are gouged into the bottom heatsink. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and I'll see if I can do it on camera. So first of all, you'll find the smaller of the flanges that doesn't have the sort of weird protruding thing out to one side. Push it all round. And then it goes on the top, and that was it clicking into place. And this is a brand new unboxed heatsink fitting onto my SSD, and it clips straight into place. It's really easy to do, and it mounts a reasonable amount of pressure as well. So it doesn't matter what side you do each one. I guess you'll probably want to do it so the little flange is maybe on the same side on each, but it doesn't really matter. So again, I'll just show you that. So the flat side. The flatter side of the U clip, you mount that on that side, making sure you line up with the small notch in the underside, and then you just bring it round. Try not to scratch the hell out of the heatsink as well while you do it, and then you just move it round. It's going to be a bit trickier to mount the second one because it's there's obviously already tension on here from the first clip. But I should be able to do this one on camera as well. Yeah, so I think you just push it up from that side, and nearly. Yeah, I'm gonna have to take this off camera and just get it a bit closer to my body so I can give it a bit more force. And yeah, there we go. Yeah, it was quite easy to do. I could have probably done that on camera, to be honest. Yeah, so there's a good deal of tension on there. As you can see, there's no bowing in the SSD at all, so it's perfectly safe to mount this heatsink. And yeah, I really like this one. It's one of the more affordable heatsinks on test. It's really easy to install, and it looks great and is available in several colours as well. So well done, EK Waterblocks, and you can see the performance testing at the end of this video. Okay, so next up is Silverstone's TPO2-M2, which is of course Silverstone's M.2 heatsink. And Silverstone, obviously well known for their cases and power supplies. They do make a couple of other M.2 accessories. They do large thermal pads that can sit between your motherboard and your M.2 SSD to improve cooling. I've tested those, they work quite well. But this is its first effort at an actual M.2 heatsink. So in the box, as you can see, I've literally just opened this. You get it's a pretty large heatsink, and it's quite elaborate as well. There's lots of stuff, lots of fins going on there. It's quite weighty, and yeah, it's a fair old chunk of aluminium. I'm guessing that probably rises up to about 9mm on the edge. So it's probably not going to fit between lots of motherboards and graphics cards. If the M.2 slot is underneath your graphics card, then you might have a bit of trouble fitting this under there. So in terms of fitment, let's get rid of all the packaging and see what we've got inside. So we've got the usual thermal pads in there, and also it's the first one that I've tested so far that actually uses rubber bands to attach the heatsink onto the SSD, which is kind of interesting because it's obviously going to be a lot easier than using some of the metal clips that you saw earlier. But it's whether or not it provides enough tension, and of course you've got these big black rubber bands going across the heatsink, which might impact on the aesthetics. You know, you kind of just want to see the heatsink. You don't want to see these big rubber bands holding it on as well. Thankfully they are black, as is the heatsink, so so they shouldn't be too noticeable. So let's have a quick look at the instructions to see how we actually mount it. So there's a whole bunch of languages on there. And yeah, it's just a simple case of applying the thermal pads. Now you've actually got 3 here, and I'm going to have a look in the instructions to see whether it's fairly clear as to which one you put where, because at the moment it doesn't seem like it. So okay, so you stick the blue thermal pad on the back of the heatsink. So that will be the one, which is this one here. That's the thicker one. So that goes on the back of the heatsink, and that's the one that's going to be in contact with your SSD. So I will just go ahead and do that now. So yeah, that needs to be lined up exactly end to end, because they're exactly the same lengths, and I think we need to remove a second layer of plastic on there as well. So that's that done. So what do we do with these other 2 heat sinks? Stick the heatsink onto the M.2 SSD and make sure the heatsink is aligned to both edges. Yep, done that. Number 3, wrap the silicone bands onto opposite edges of the motherboard and install. But there's a step 4, which you should kind of read first, which states that if your M.2 SSD is used on an adapter, apply the grey thermal pad onto the back of the M.2 as well. So basically, if you've got, if you're using a PCI Express card or something like that, you need to use one or other of these, the grey coloured SSDs. If you're just using a single one of these, a single SSD, and you're plugging it into your motherboard, all you need to do is just to whack that down on there and then apply the thermal pads. That's all you need to do. There's no rear heatsink here to deal with, so that's literally all you need to do. Just apply the blue heatsink, stick the heatsink on top, and away you go. So let's see how the rubber bands work. Well, that's certainly the easiest installation that I've seen. There's not a whole load of tension there, I have to admit. The bands could have been a bit tighter, I think. So if we just get that, it's difficult holding it at the same time. Okay, so there we go. And they do have like a, I don't know if you can see that on the camera, they do have like a slight sort of, it's almost like a leopard skin, like a dotted effect on the things to make them look a little more attractive than just bare rubber bands. And that's pretty much it. I mean, the actual thermal pad is relatively sticky, and there's a fair amount of pressure on there. Probably enough to make sure that you're not losing any cooling potential by doing that. But it's a relatively simple SSD. It's very cheap as well. I couldn't actually find a price for it in the US at the moment, but in the UK it's only £4.99. So this is one of the cheapest heatsinks around. It's also the most easy. It's also the easiest to install as well. You just saw I did that on camera in about 10 seconds. So it's much easier and less intrusive and less likely to scratch everything than the clipped heatsinks are. But the only downside is there's not quite as much tension, and it's maybe not quite as attractive looking. Certainly as the UK Waterblocks heatsink. So anyway, that's the Silverstone heatsink done. As I say, we'll deal with all the performance numbers at the end, and for now that's it. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so there's 3 more heatsinks to go, and next up is the SubZero M.2 from Gelid. And I couldn't find a price for this in the US. In the UK it costs about £8, so it's pretty reasonable. And it also looks like it's another heatsink, just like the last one that we saw, that actually uses small rubber bands to actually hold the M.2 heatsink onto the SSD. So let's just pop the box open and have a look and see what we get. So this one again is available in several different colours. I think the only other one on test to actually do that is the EK Waterblocks heatsink. And looks like we're dealing with thermal pads and all that kind of malarkey again. So let's get all of those out. So instead of actual rubber bands, you've actually got 3 rubber O-rings here. They look quite a bit like O-rings you'd use with PC water cooling, except these will sit over the top of the heatsink and just strap it down. And there is no backplate to deal with here, and you do have 2 different thickness thermal pads. So I'm just going to have a quick look at the instructions to see what ones you need to do. Right, so this is kind of interesting. So what you need to do is, if all the components are at pretty much the same height on your PCB, which they are on the Samsung 960 Pro, which I've got here, you need to use the thinner thermal pad. So if all the knobbly bits on there are slightly uneven, overall you can tell that by looking end on. If they're all fairly level, you can use the thin pad. But if they're all knobbly and all over the place and different heights and that kind of thing, then you need to use the thicker pad, because that will tend to even things out. I think that's Gelid's reasoning there. So what I would do is just quickly place the thermal pad onto the SSD like so. And then we just need to remove the plastic layer on top like that. So I'm guessing you can do this onto your heatsink or straight onto your SSD like I'm doing. With the really thin ones like this, and I tend to prefer to lay them straight onto the SSD because they can kind of get really sticky otherwise. So there we go, that's the thermal pad laid on, and then we just lay the actual heatsink on top. So there's quite a bit of excess there with the thermal pad, so I think what you probably need to do is probably cut off about 5mm to actually stop it overlapping like that, because as you see I can't quite see the screw hole there. So worth remembering to do that before you actually mount it, but it does look quite attractive. It's very low profile. I'm guessing it's probably about 5mm top to bottom. Very low profile, so ideal for fitting into tight situations that the likes of the EK water blocks and the Silverstone heatsinks won't be able to do. And it looks like it should be fairly easy to install as well. So these O-rings, they seem to be a lot tighter, should provide a bit more tension than the ones we saw on the last one. There's little grooves in the heatsink as well that should hold them in place, and so there's just 3 of those that need dealing with. And you can just kind of just roll it down. It's really easy to do, and as per the photos, that's the 3 things on, and basically that's it. So yeah, it kind of looks a bit funny with the bands on top. Again, with the EK water blocks heatsink, you don't have to do that. The clips go on the side and you get a full view of the top heatsink. But we're certainly with the Gelid SSD, you're looking at something that's you've got those 3 bands on the top, so it might not be to everybody's tastes. Good thing is though, it's pretty cheap, and I'm guessing with the tension, it's going to perform as well as a lot of the other heatsinks as well. So that's it from the Gelid one, and I'm going to move on to the next heatsink. Okay, so next up we've got one of 2 generic M.2 heatsinks that I found on Amazon. This one, it doesn't really have a name. It's from a company called, Nia, which I'm guessing is probably Chinese in origin. But being an M.2 heatsink, thankfully there's no electronics involved. But it costs just $10.99, and you actually get 2 heatsinks in here. So it's kind of cool that they literally only cost about $5 each. So that's not too bad in my books, although you've probably only got one M.2 SSD. If you're lucky enough to have 2, that's great for you. But I'm not entirely sure why they've decided to include 2 in the bag. But anyway, and also something that might put other people off is the fact that you have to use these bright orange elastic bands to actually hold the heatsink onto the SSD. So the heatsink itself, pretty good quality, aluminium, about 3 or 4mm high. Fairly solid. You do actually have a very small sort of heatsink pattern in there, but it's not, overly tall just for the sake of it. So you're going to get reasonable cooling from this, but it is, mostly a low profile heatsink. So installing it, very, very easy. There's 2 heat pads here because obviously we've got 2 heat pads because we've got 2 heat sinks, and all you need to do is place the thermal pad. It's quite a thick thermal pad, so it is actually going to add quite a bit of height. I'm guessing that's 2mm, so it is going to add quite a bit of height to the heatsink once you've actually mounted it onto the SSD, like so. And there we go. So that's bumped it up from about sort of 3 or 4mm up to about 8 in total, with the heatsink and that massive thermal pad there as well. And that's probably to cater for the fact that there are lots of SSDs out there that might not have a flat top like the Samsung does here. Anyway, so it's it looks pretty good. It's fairly solid feeling. There's no sort of jagged edges. It's made reasonably well, which is good. And installing it with these rubber bands, there's no sort of massive issue there really. It's fairly easy to do. They have a reasonable amount of tension. I'm guessing probably similar to the Gelid heatsink that we looked at a minute ago, and yeah, just very easy to install. So possibly still just about catering for low profile users, if you need if you've got a very severe height limitation. But other than that, it's just a very cheap, cheerful heatsink, which should hopefully perform relatively well and give you a bargain way of cooling your SSD. And the Amazon reviews seem to point at that as well. There's 28 reviews so far, 4.5 out of 5 seems to be doing pretty well. So you can see the link to the SSD in the link below if you wanted to buy one for just $10.99. And as I said, you get 2 heatsinks in the box as well. So if you do end up adding another SSD at some point, you've got another SSD along with another thermal pad and 2 further installation bands to mount it as well. The only downside, as I say, is that the bands are a bit garish, but other than that, no complaints. So let's move on to the final heatsink. Okay, so the final SSD we're going to be looking at is the Advancing Gene anodized aluminium heatsink, and it goes for a pretty reasonable $13.50 on Amazon. It's also got pretty good reviews. Again, it looks like it's just a generic aluminium heatsink, sort of Chinese in origin, but it is actually made fairly well. You know, there's no sharp edges or anything there, and I've just fitted the thermal pad onto it. So it's fairly thick thermal pad. It's relatively low profile still. You're probably looking at about 4 or 5 millimeters total height, even with the heatsink and the thermal pad installed as well. So let's get that mounted onto our SSD and have a look and see how we go about installing it. Now, I've looked at the instructions, and there's a couple of things in the box that you should also be aware of. One is a couple of cleaning pads, which is a nice touch, and the instructions also show the use of the metal clips. There's 2 metal clips that come in the box, there they are, and there are also 3 rubber bands or O-rings that come in the box as well. Now, the rubber bands you should be using in a laptop, presumably to prevent short circuits and that kind of thing. So we'll just see how they fit on like so. There's not a whole load of tension there, I have to admit. It's very, very easy to install them, which is no bad thing, of course, given what we had to do with some of the other ones. And to be honest, they do actually look pretty cool. They look like they might be metal when you actually get them mounted on. You know, they've got a very similar sort of satiny look to the metal, the heatsink as well. And yeah, they really don't look too bad, do they? My only concern there, as I say, would be that they don't provide a huge amount of tension. You know, there's quite a lot of flex in the bands as they are, but whether or not that's going to impact on cooling, we'll have to wait for the performance numbers later. So let's remove those and see what we do with the metal clips. Now, the metal clips you can use in your PC. You shouldn't use them in a laptop for the reasons I've mentioned, due to short circuits presumably. And I think you just kind of lift those lips up onto the heatsink like so. So it's pretty easy to install, I think. Again, there's possibly even less force here in terms of holding the heatsink onto the SSD than the rubber O-rings. So I'd maybe have some concerns about, you know, the pressure, but again, I'll check that out in the cooling. So yeah, it looks probably even better with these clips on than it does the actual O-rings. Very inconspicuous, and it looks pretty good. So as I say, that one retails for about $13–14 on Amazon, and you can see the link below. Pretty cheap, not quite as cheap as the last one we looked at, but probably better looking. The mounting mechanisms are far less intrusive on your eyes, at least. And that's it from the unboxing and installation part of the video. So you can stick around for a couple of minutes and I'll run through the performance numbers. Okay, so let's take a look at the results. And as you can see, I've got a graph here with everything on it. And this graph looks at the results that I've taken from the top M.2 slot on a 2-slot motherboard. So this slot is located above the graphics card, but it's in amongst the memory slots and the processor socket, that kind of thing. So probably not the best airflow in this area. So this graph kind of looks at the worst case scenario for a lot of these SSDs. Now, as a couple of them are too large to fit under a graphics card, you know, I haven't tested how they do under a graphics card. Ideally, you probably wouldn't want to use that slot for your SSD anyway. The result is a delta T temperature, so that is the absolute result, which is the result that I've got from the software that I was monitoring, minus the ambient temperature. So the ambient temperature was around 23-24 degrees. It did vary by a couple of degrees, which is what the delta T is for. So if the ambient temperature goes down, it obviously you subtract a lower figure from the absolute result, so it kind of evens out and allows you to get fairly comparable results in a non-temperature controlled environment, which is what I was using. But as I say, the temperature results didn't really vary by more than a degree or two on the day anyway. So first of all then, you have the no heatsink result, so that's without a heatsink in that top slot of the motherboard, and that was a delta T of 52 degrees, an absolute temperature in the software of around 70 to 75 degrees. So that's obviously fairly toasty, and that's after a triple run of Crystal Disk Mark, which puts the SSD under load for about 10 or 15 minutes. And mimics like a high workload over a long period of time. So the worst performing heatsink on test is the Alphacool heatsink, but even then it still managed to knock 11 degrees C off the temperature of not having a heatsink at all. So it's definitely worth considering. But obviously with no sort of fins or anything on the heatsink, it's no big surprise to see that it's the worst performing one on test there. So next, I'll actually mention the next 5 here, because as you can see, they all fall within 2 degrees C, which is pretty much within the margin of error. So everything from the Gelid all the way up to the EK Waterblocks heatsink is pretty much performs the same. There's not really that much between them. So I wouldn't want to say that the EK Waterblocks is the second worst performing heatsink on test, for the simple reason that really it isn't, because there's only 2 degrees C between it and the Gelid. But there's obviously 3 degrees C between it and the Alphacool. So yeah, it's not the best result for Alphacool there, but then again, it is the thinnest, lowest profile heatsink on test. Now, there is one standout result here, which as you can see is the Adata XPG, which is the most expensive and largest heatsink on test, and it has a fan. And quite simply, a result of 37 degrees here is shocking. For such a large heatsink and one that's equipped with a fan, you'd expect it to be well over the top of the graph and the best performing heatsink here. The fact that it did produce some noise as well means that, you know, the fact that it only managed 1 degree C lower than the EK Waterblocks, basically it's a shocking product, and clearly it doesn't work very well and should be avoided really. So the next 2 heatsinks are the obviously the larger ones on test. The 33 degrees was for the Aqua Computer heatsink. Pretty good. It's a fairly large heatsink, and it managed to knock another 3 degrees C off the next best result, which was the Gelid. And finally, no surprise there, the Silverstone, the very large M.2 heatsink, that got the best result on test, 10 degrees C lower than the Alphacool, and getting on for 20 degrees C, well actually no, more than 20 degrees C lower than using no heatsink at all. So overall there, pretty good for result from every heatsink apart from the Adata XPG Storm, the RGB heatsink, because with an active cooled heatsink, you'd expect it to do way better than that given how big it is. So let's take a look at the next graph. Okay, so this is now the lower M.2 slot, which mounted in my case. It actually got a bit of airflow flowing over the heatsink here, so that really is key to keeping M.2 SSDs cool, is to having some sort of airflow to kind of stop the build-up of heat. And what the heatsinks do is they basically extend that the time that it takes to sort of saturate the heatsink with heat. So they also obviously increase the surface area of the heatsink of the SSD as well, which is why they're usually a good idea. So in the open then, the Samsung 960 Evo got a delta T of 45 degrees, so the absolute temperature was about 20-25 degrees hotter than that. Again, the Alphacool was the worst performing heatsink on test, but it still managed to knock 12 degrees C off that no heatsink test result there. So it's clearly able to, you know, sort of aid the SSD in getting rid of the heat, especially mounted in this location. Obviously performs a bit better. And the next one, again, EK water blocks, about 32 degrees, so not that much better than the Alphacool. And again, you've got lots and lots of very similar results here because, you know, the heatsink is doing fairly well on its own. It's already dropped its own temperature just because it's in a better location. And yeah, so most of the next bunch within 2 degrees of each other. The Adata XPG, again, a pretty poor result from that SSD given how large and noisy it was. So it's just not really worth considering how much cheaper the likes of the Nia Advancing and Gelid heatsinks are. Again though, the Aqua Computer SSD still managed to knock a little bit further off, a little bit more temperature off, so you've got 2 degrees better than the next performing heatsink and 3 degrees better than much of the rest of the field. And finally, again, that massive Silverstone heatsink, it managed the best result yet again of 28 degrees C delta T. So bearing in mind the ambient temperature was around 23-24 degrees, you know, that's still a fairly big difference compared to the to using no heatsink. Okay, so the overall winner then, probably unsurprisingly, is the Silverstone TPO2. It's an awesome performing M.2 heatsink, offers the lowest temperatures across the board in every test, beating every other heatsink that I could find. It's also very, very easy to install, just a couple of elastic bands around it, but that didn't seem to impact on its performance. And it's also pretty cheap. It's one of the cheapest heatsinks on test, so it gets my vote if you want something that's cheap and very, very effective. Just be aware of its height and also the fact that it's not particularly attractive. And that really brings me on to the heatsink that I would probably buy if I was going to actually buy one, which is the EK water blocks, of course. It looks absolutely stunning. It's available in a range of colours, allowing you to colour match it to your case or your motherboard. As I said, it's relatively easy to install, and performance-wise, it's not the best performing heatsink on test, but it offers a huge performance benefit compared to not using a heatsink at all. It covers both the bottom and top side of the heatsink, and yeah, it just looks absolutely awesome. So that would be the one that I would buy, I think. So that's it. Thanks for watching this very, very long video, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Always appreciated, and thanks for watching.